Question, well, why have I changed so much? I don't know why Earl still thinks the way he does, but he can speak for himself, but I definitely have changed. And it's been a long, kind of painful process, which involved losing a lot of my friends and colleagues. You know, so I just kind of go through that. And really, I came here in 1980 to head up an environmental group. And for much of the first 10 years of that, I was kind of just barely, hoping I could just survive and do my thing. And I didn't really work on land use or transportation at all. I just deferred to other colleagues of mine, people at Thousand Friends and elsewhere. If they said, yeah, sure, whatever, that's your beat, must be right. And by the time I got into the 1990s, I sort of had a grip on my job, and OEC hadn't yet, careened off the cliff. And I thought, like, maybe I could begin to investigate these issues more on my own instead of just being spoon-fed by people because they were smart and friends of mine. And, the reason I come to where I am now really is because the evidence has led me there. The theory is very seductive, but it doesn't hold up. And I refuse to live my life in a world of, sort of mirrors and echo chambers. And the first thing that kind of moved me in that direction has to do with, I received a complimentary copy of a book in 1994. It was a book of land use essays published by Oregon State University of academics. And one of the essays, and at that time I really knew very little about land use, but I thought I should get more knowledgeable. And one of the essays, it went to the whole, the rationale for land use, statewide land use planning in Oregon, of which we're a pioneer, is, Dick Benner, now a land use lawyer at Metro and a very prominent lawyer, he once gave a speech where he said, well, basically you can summarize the whole program in 2 words: urban containment. Basically get everyone on the urban reservation and keep most people off of the rest of the state. So this essay says, goes into this whole drill about these assumptions and then just says, well, the database to support these assumptions is quite weak. In general, Oregon legislators and state planning officials have not fully tested the validity of widely held beliefs and assumptions underlying the land use program. Okay, now, was that written by Randall O'Toole? No, it was actually written by an academic in a book. The whole purpose of the book was to celebrate 20 years of land use planning in Oregon. I thought, well, if that's what a land use supporter has to say, that there's essentially no empirical evidence as to why we even do all this stuff, what do critics have to say? So I thought, John, you really got to wake up here and look into this stuff. Well, then the 2040 process was underway, the big visioning process by Metro, and friends of mine like Ethan Seltzer were very involved with that. And I got a call from Tom Walsh, then the head of TriMet, to come to sort of a VIP briefing, because I was head of OEC, so I got to come to briefings where they gave me like a fruit tray and free drinks. So that's how I knew I was part of a VIP briefing, to get kind of the scoop on this whole thing. And really, it was kind of stunning to listen to planners pretty much tell me what was going to happen. I could see right away that what we had to say wasn't going to matter a whole lot. In a sense, there's this sort of contempt for things, well, a phrase I didn't know about before, this thing called big box retail, where you drive a lot. It was just, to me, I just thought those stores were places that had a lot of great selection at a low price. But I realized there was a pejorative, and we weren't going to allow too many of those. And so right away, my antenna went up, and I said, okay, 2040, visions, okay, better be alert here. So anyway, Metro hired a lot of good people. They had a lot of good people working for them, and they hired a lot of consultants. And I read all this stuff, and I wrote up 16 pages of comments on behalf of my employer at the time, OEC, in which I quoted much of this consultant work saying, gee, this whole business of tight urban growth boundaries and the urban land cartel that we have in Oregon of downzoning rural Oregon and trying to keep people on the urban reservations, et cetera, is going to have certain dysfunctional outcomes. And I wrote up this, and I showed it to my policy committee at OEC. And they said, well, John, my problem is if you cut the first 12 pages of your 16 pages testimony, you're good to go. And that, in fact, it all got censored out. All my good stuff got left on the cutting room floor, and that definitely was a sign to me that it was going to be time to move on. And that there was no dissent allowed. All of my colleagues at OEC loved it when I was into congestion pricing because they viewed that as punishing motorists. I just viewed it as a really great way to make highways work better. But as soon as I dared to question growth boundaries in light rail, well, then it was time to be excommunicated from the church. And a couple years later, I retired from OEC. We had a fun little party. I got a nice gift. We left as friends, pretty much, acknowledging that it was definitely time to move on. So That whole process of 2040 was a wake-up for me as a participant to realize, the train was coming down the track, so to speak. Wasn't much I could do about it. And then finally, by a fluke purchase, I bought a house moving from downtown to the east side, kind of the far east side. And I actually moved there because I like trains. I grew up near New York, and I didn't want to move to the west side because there were no trains. The East Side Light Rail was the only game in town, and so I wanted to become a light rail commuter. So it's kind of stupid, or it's embarrassing to admit this, but I actually bought a house on the basis of where light rail was, sort of. I mean, I live well beyond the end of light rail, but that's actually a good thing. If you've ever ridden the Washington, D.C. subway, you know that the best deal is to live beyond the end, go there and get on when there are still seats, because a couple stops later, all the seats are gone, and that's your reward for sprawling. So anyway, riding on light rail thousands of times, creeping along very slowly, kind of gave me a lot of time to think about why this wasn't working as well as I thought it would work. And again, I began to investigate things, and it's kind of disheartening. So at this point, I'm going to, if we can dim the lights a little bit and have my colleague show us a few slides. I'm not going to torture you with a long PowerPoint presentation, just 8 slides that sort of say why I have reached these conclusions. This is a data set from development, 97 development, not 97, over 70 projects in Portland, was published in 97. Cost of density. Now, so this is not modeling. This is not theoretical or speculation. This is empirical evidence. I hear a lot about, well, sprawl is expensive and infill is cheaper, and we got to, keep people on the urban reservations because it's cheaper. But for those of you who are on the tour today, realize when you do mixed-use, high-density projects, the simple construction techniques of thicker pads and complex electrical codes and the highest unionized labor out there of iron workers and crane operators, et cetera, when the cost of density is expensive. So this notion that flat land outside here is too expensive to build on compared to infill projects, empirically that's false. Next slide. Just another way of putting it, the same by height. There's a pretty strong relationship here. So it's not that these projects don't make sense. Lots of high-rises do make sense, and if the market will bear them, that's fine. But we should not argue for this sort of urban containment model because somehow it's cheaper. I don't think it is. Go ahead. Earl mentioned John Kane, the recently deceased Harvard economist who is a transit expert, and this is a database he put together showing in terms of the average construction cost per daily trip. In terms of, when you do it in that way, you can see right away, and this is a cross-section of projects from around the country. It's not every single project ever built. But if you were going to, my view is, if you were going to invest your money, not someone else's pork barrel money, your money on transportation investments, you would instantly delete 2 things. Okay, but because light rail and heavy rail, we live in a world of pork where people get to spend everyone else's money. We focus on this, and so as John Kane used to say, I support transit. I'm just opposed to wasteful transit, and that's my view. So we're picking up a signal here that this vision we're doing in Portland is pushing very expensive stuff, construction techniques and transit. Go ahead, next slide. Now this is out of the original planning documents for North Portland Light Rail, which is going to be opening in a couple weeks. When it actually opens and runs, the cost figures may change, but at the time it was projected, you can see that, again, if you're going to spend your money wisely, if you want the most bang for the buck of transit, you're not going to be building fixed rail. You're going to take buses, especially, primarily because they can use the ubiquitous, already built road system to go to an infinite number of places, sharing the cost of the road system with millions of motorists. Next slide. Also, of course, that vision involves cannibalizing scarce road space, taking a 4-lane arterial, going down to 2 lanes to have very minimal throughput of trains, therefore causing more congestion everywhere else. Next. Again, as predicted in the document, I'm not sure that North Portland congestion from LRT is the correct word. Traffic is probably the more accurate way to put it, but certainly in terms of freight, who don't benefit from fixed rail at all, when you take away 2 lanes, they have to go somewhere. And so already you have more traffic everywhere else. and those people did not perceive their lives as having been improved by cannibalizing scarce road space. Go ahead. This is out of the 2040 vision, so we're going to get lots of increase in congestion. I don't think people particularly like that, and I think this is preventable. It's not necessary if we had chosen, and if we choose in the future, the near future, to do other things. Go ahead. And as Metro noted in a 1994 document, and I think this is a very, after comparing Portland with about 54 other jurisdictions statistically, it's a very reasoned way of putting this. Earl talked about housing and affordability. Comment here, the downside of pursuing these objectives appears to be higher housing price and reduced housing output. That is not saying that land use planning causes all housing increases, which it doesn't. There are lots of factors. What it says is you cannot maximize all objectives simultaneously. There are things called opportunity cost. And if you create an urban cartel, you are going to have, all else being equal, you're going to have an upward price effect on raw land, and that's going to reflect on the price of the finished product. And I believe the Metro economists accurately stated in 1994 something that they would probably state today, that there are these trade-offs, and the Metro vision involves this downside. And I think to deny this distorts the argument. Just as I would not blame all rises of house increase on land use planning, to say that it has no effect is dishonest. I think that's the last slide. This has kind of pushed me in the direction, and last year I went to a public lecture at Portland State University where the first Metro executive, Rick Gustafson, was speaking, and he was speaking on tape. It's archived on the web, and I asked him a question about congestion and the effect of what we're doing. And he's a contemporary he was once one of the young Turks like Earl. And he just was very adamant. He said, John, I like congestion. I don't want to make it easy for 60,000 people to come over from Vancouver every day. And he talked about, well, when I was at Metro, we used to have this goal of having the maximum number of places you could get or maximum travel in 30 minutes. And, that was a really stupid idea. It was like he was in the jargon of Washington, D.C., he was describing this as some kind of youthful indiscretion, I guess, like, having sex with interns, that he once actually aspired to have maximum mobility in the 30-minute time period. But he's learned now, so he and I, like, trips traveling in the dark, he likes congestion. Okay, I'm not on board with that. So my view is that the Portland vision is not, quote, sustainable in any meaningful sense of the word, because it's certainly raising the price of lots of things. Certainly a lot of the transit projects are massive money losers, and if something is a money loser, it is not sustainable. Somebody has to make money somewhere. And so I've spent a lot of time in the last 7 years looking for other alternatives. Lots of people, of course, in visual preference surveys, as Earl said, will say they like something as long as someone else bears all the cost. But now that we're forcing density into the outlying areas, they don't like it very much. An Oregonian headline from 2 weeks ago said, Happy Valley hillsides filling up with homes. Developers upsetting some neighbors turn to slopes as flat sites within the urban boundary grow scarce. Of course, this is all legal. This is the plan for Portland. And as one neighbor put it, well, they raped the hill with integrity. I want to give them credit. They did everything they said they were going to do. So, that's the Oregon system. Lots of planning, lots of process. Actual outcomes don't matter too much, but they rape the hill with integrity. So, I don't really view what we're doing here as good planning or good for the environment. I'm still pretty much a tree hugger. I'm an environmental activist. But I view what we're doing as mostly about power, job protection, preservation of the status quo. It's ironic that so many of my friends who back when they were in their teens and early 20s viewed themselves as social change agents are now staunch conservatives and defenders of a status quo that needs to be changed. But it's painful to do that. Why would they walk away from something that's working well for them? Well, and I'll take a few minutes in anticipating what Andy might say, because I did get a direct mail piece from Alternatives to Growth Oregon recently, just this week, so I'm up to date on what they're all about. And I've been on their website before, and one of the key things is making growth pay its own way. And I'm definitely in favor of that. But I think some of the assertions made about, frequently made in Oregon here about, well, each new home that comes along is subsidized by some $30,000, and it goes on and on. I think those are vastly overstated. We already have substantial system development charges in Oregon. In many locations, they're locally driven. And much of that money is pork barreled away anyway. If you look at transportation SDCs in Oregon or in Portland, for instance, there was the case of the pizza shop owner who wanted to move his pizza store across the street and was assessed a SDC for transportation. I believe it was for $27,000 for all the new traffic he would generate. Of course, he became quite irate at this since he was only moving across the street. He wasn't increasing footage or whatever. And the city council heard his story, and he was covered by the media. And they said, gee, that's really too bad. You know, we feel your pain. Send us the check. Shut up and go away. And that's what the answer was, get out of here. I've looked at the computer printouts of SDC transportation money in Portland, and you know, the money comes in, and if it was actually spent to mitigate the problem you cause in your neighborhood, that would make some sense, but that's not the way it works. They got a long list of projects, streetcars, light rail, et cetera, stuff many miles away from your neighborhood. So you could triple the SDC, and it really wouldn't get at the concern Andy has about paying for growth because the money's being pork barreled away. You know, and I look at Portland and say, well, really, if the Portland model, if dense living and building up, not out, is cheaper, then infrastructure services in Portland should be cheaper. But it's pretty hard to find anywhere that's the case. The Oregonian had a big story recently. They have the third most expensive sewer and water bills in the country, only behind Seattle and San Diego. We have a $1 billion plus combined sewer overflow project, much of which is caused by density, loss of impervious surfaces. We have a massively expensive transit system, which is subsidized by large suburban employers who send huge amounts of payroll tax money to TriMet to spend on a system designed to benefit the central city. And towns and cities like Wilsonville and Sandy, who have exited successfully, opted out of TriMet to run their own transit system and get way better service for way less cost. And we have an unfunded police and fire pension liability of more than $1.25 million in Portland, and growing as the Portland City Council refuses to deal with it. So, you know, I don't see infrastructure services in Portland as being somehow less expensive than the suburbs. I see that as the reverse. So I'm not sure why we want to use this as a great model. Plus, assumed growth, whatever that is not the same as actual growth. You know, what good would right now it's illegal to do SDCs for schools, and there are a number of people who always want the legislature to allow this, but my view is, well, what good would that do? Because new homes don't demand schools. Some families do. Those families who want a big box government, they're the ones who want the free education, and there is no planning solution to that. You could shut down the permit office, you could put a moratorium on building, you could have growth boundaries that never move, you could have monster SDCs, and a family could buy an old historic home with lots of bedrooms in it already that was built 100 years ago, proceed to have a dozen kids, and they would get, you know, about a $10,000 a year subsidy. So if you really want growth to pay for itself, and Andy's studies and every study I've seen on growth indicates that government schooling is the largest single infrastructure subsidy to growth. If you really want growth to pay its way, the only solution in that case is to abolish school taxation, return that money to people's pockets, privatize the schools, and have people take care of schooling as they do with food, shelter, and clothing, which is they bear that decision-making privately, both the costs and the benefits. Then schooling would pay for itself. Now, at Cascade, we're in favor of that. We think that's an excellent idea. And anytime the Alternative to Growth people or Representative Blumenauer or anybody wants to join us in a joint press release pushing that, that would be a great idea. But I rarely come across growth control people who really deal with the school subsidy. And if you don't deal with that, you know, it's kind of pointless to talk about water or sewer or transportation. So hey, take a few minutes to mention some solutions that I'm fond of, and then I'll turn the mic over to Andy. Ordinarily, I get very concerned about how much time I take, and I am respectful of your time, but given the previous filibuster, I feel like I think I can slide in under the hour time that the previous speaker used. So, for one thing, we got to replace user fees for taxes. And I've had legislators tell me, Mr. Charles, that's semantics. If it looks like a duck and walks like a duck, it is a duck. And I say, no, Representative, it's not. A tax is not the same as a user fee. User fee, you pay for what you want and don't pay for what you don't want. And if you're interested in pursuing this, there's a wonderful little, very readable book that's only not even 100 pages by an obscure Canadian economist named Philip Paula. It's called Home on the Urban Range, an idea map for reforming the city. And the urban range, as he talks about it, the analogy is the tragedy of the commons and public lands. You have open access and all kinds of hell breaks loose, and no one has responsibility for it. You degrade the resource. And he's an urbanist. He loves cities. He doesn't like suburbs. In that way, he and I differ. But he makes the whole case for why having people pay only for what they want and not paying for what they want would take the inherent advantages of cities and maximize them and make them much better. And it's a really fascinating book. He talks in a very chatty way. It's not all egghead stuff. And really, it's worth reading. And I'll just say, I always look for historic examples so that I can say this is not just theoretical. Did it ever work in Portland? And in the case of Portland, the first bridge over the Willamette River was the first Morrison Bridge. It was subsequently replaced. At that time, it opened in July of 1880. It was the largest bridge west of the Rockies. And it was built by two private contractors. And it was a toll bridge, of course, because in those days, user fees, really, that was the way to finance infrastructure. And so the fee was 20 cents for 2 horses and a driver, 10 cents each for loose cattle and horses. And they even had the temerity to charge pedestrians 5 cents. There were a lot of pedestrians in those days. And, they weren't sacred cows the way they are now. Everyone had to pay their fair share because the alternative was the first ferry in Portland was the Stark Street Ferry. And there was a lot of concern by the ferry operators that this bridge has to be a pay-as-you-go deal because the ferry owners charge. So the bridge was a toll bridge. It opened, and so it was a very fair way to pay for infrastructure. You had, as a consumer, 2 choices, bridge, ferry. If you chose not to go across the bridge, you weren't sucked into paying for the decision-making of everybody else. Great idea, great American concept. So in a classic example of why government shouldn't run services, on July 3rd, 1895, 15 years later, the city, it might have been the county, but the city, anyway, local government, purchased the bridge and, as politicians are wont to do, abolished tolls. Now, aren't we great? We relieved you from those bad tolls, free for everybody, utopia. Well, the most immediate effect of that was to put the Stark Street Ferry out of business. Kind of tough to compete with a free bridge. So now, as consumers, you had one choice, not 2. And if you never crossed the bridge, you were still roped into paying for the decisions of everybody else. So, it's an excellent example of why we should have infrastructure services provided by private entrepreneurs in a competitive market, and we don't need to theorize about it. We did it a long time ago. And all over the world today, bridges, tunnels, turnpikes, they're being built either with private money or public money, but they're being charged, repaid through tolls. Highway 407 in Toronto, SR 91, California, I-15 in San Diego. Peter Samuels, who here is, Mr. Toll Road guy. He knows everything about them, and I think he's making a presentation. They're providing new capacity, they're charging variable rates, collecting them electronically, no these old-fashioned toll gates, people are happy. That's the way to go. It's a tough sell in Oregon, among Oregon politicians, but around the world in more progressive places, this is happening. So now, second point is privatization. It's not enough to just have user fees. If it's a user fee being paid to a government monopoly, there's really pretty soon there won't be much difference between the fee and the tax, and you can guarantee lots of pork barreling. If you've never read Stephen Goldsmith's book, he's the former mayor of Indianapolis. He wrote a book called The 21st Century City, and it's a wonderful book, very readable, about his experience doing privatization in Indianapolis, and it paints a very nice kind of roadmap for how you do it and the practical politics of dealing with patronage and municipal employee unions, et cetera, et cetera. You know, Stephen is not an academic like me. He actually is a politician who made this stuff work in a real environment. And we had him in town a while back. He's a wonderful speaker, and I highly recommend his book if you're into this. Also, Warren Buffett, on his website, announcing to his shareholders at Berkshire Hathaway recently, his annual report is very chatty, includes all kinds of little digressions. And he writes, on March 31st, 1990, the day electric utilities in the UK were denationalized, Northern and Yorkshire Electric had 6,800 employees and functions. These companies continue to perform today. Now they employ 2,500 employees, fewer than half. Yet the companies are serving about the same number of customers as when they were government owned and are distributing more electricity. This is not a triumph of deregulation. Prices and earnings continue to be regulated in a fair manner by the government, just as they should be. I don't necessarily agree with him on that point, but it is a victory, however, for those who believe that profit-motivated managers will find efficiencies that government never will. So I just say, think TriMet, our transit agency. Think Portland Water Bureau. Dysfunctional government monopolies that cannot be reformed by appointing better boards and holding hands and singing Kumbaya and having visioning exercises. Okay, they need competition and privatization. And I guess the final point is to replace prescriptive zoning with performance zoning. I certainly agree with Earl that you look around the country, and as a number of new urbanists have said, you can't do transitory development in many parts of the country. It's illegal. And also sprawl has been institutionalized all over the country by the government through 10-acre, 15, 20, 60 minimum lot sizes, of course, to keep out certain classes of people, or to prevent mixed-use, transit-oriented development, to have this really boring, generic, cookie-cutter, top-down zoning. Right, well, that is a problem with allowing your property rights to be collectivized and taken over by everyone, so you have to grovel in front of some board to get a permit to build, something. And I just view prescriptive zoning as terminally dysfunctional. It cannot be fixed. We put it on steroids here in Portland to make it do all kinds of other things, and by and large, it still doesn't work. I don't think we need we should not care about categories of use. And there's an infinite number of things you could do with your property. Personally, to me, it's like saying, what are you doing in your bedroom at night? I really don't want to know. Just don't bother me. I don't care what you're doing in your property. Just don't bother me. We should focus on environmental outcomes, not categories of use. And we don't need growth boundaries. We're a public land state. About 60% of the state is already in public ownership, and that is increasing probably by the day. And that's a de facto set of growth boundaries. I think the other part of the state can be privately managed. And again, it's not a new idea. It's been used in other cities. And some of the best neighborhoods in Portland that have served the test of time, that are great neighborhoods today, were platted and built out in the 1890s through 1920 before anybody in the country was doing any kind of zoning. And one of the nice neighborhoods here that I like to point out that I once lived in that you might visit is Ladd's Addition. It's a funky, sort of close-in neighborhood characterized by circles and cute little rose gardens and streets shaped like isosceles triangles and parallelograms. And it's a very cool place. And it was built in 1892. Actually, it was built over a 20-year period before anyone was doing zoning on what was prime farmland. And according to the Oregonian of that era, they announced Mr. Ladd, the developer, has had the addition all platted and laid out, and it is perhaps not going too far to assert that this is the most attractive addition ever put on the Portland market. He has not only made every preparation to pave all the streets at his own expense, but he has provided for supplying the residents with gas and electric lights, provided a splendid system of sewerage and drainage. He will lay sidewalks fronting on every block, and he will have a perfect water system. Now, this is 1892. Did this without the benefit of a municipal planning department on prime farmland outside the central city. Most of this, I think, would be all illegal today, or at least it would take you many decades of humbling yourself before a number of boards to get some permits. And Ladd's Addition was then and is today a great place. So you know, we don't need to say, well, gee, Houston's the nirvana for libertarians. Portland was a pretty great place before we got into top-down government planning. So I'll just close by saying a lot of the stuff that Congressman Blumenauer likes has a certain seductive appeal. I understand that. And I believed in that for a long time, but I think it's pretty clear from the worldwide experience that central planning doesn't work. Markets work better, and I think we ought to be encouraging markets and individual opportunity in land use planning and growth management. Thank you.